The Indian devotees had an intricate communication system that allowed them at least 30% of the time to trace Maharajji and know of his whereabouts within a day of his arrival in any town or village. We Westerners were not so lucky, and so we had to use our wits, our intuitions, our cunning, and our unmitigated gall to get to his feet. Our percentage of success was perhaps not so impressive as that of the Indian devotees, but our style and our dramatic entrances and exits certainly were. I was having Maharajji's darshans, and all of a sudden Tukaram walked up. I asked Tukaram how he had gotten in, and he said, "Oh, I jumped over the wall." And I thought, "Oh God, well, I won't be here for long." Then Krishna Priya climbed in. The Chowkidar saw her climbing over the wall, and since he didn't want to take the blame for letting them in, he went to tell Maharajji. The gatekeeper said, "Baba, these people climbed over the wall. I am sorry, I did the best I could to keep them out." Maharajji's initial reaction to the Chowkidar's report was this: "Get them out, get them out, get them all out." I got thrown out too. We Westerners shared the guilt among us. We came back the next day for darshan and discovered that overnight the wall had been doubled in height. Many levels, many changes. When you finally arrived at the right place at the right time and were told, "Yes, he is here," and found yourself seated before him, what was it like? When the tongues and hands of the gods and goddesses of speech, music and poetry could not do justice to those occasions, so how could I like the blind man with the elephant? Each devotee met a different Maharajji. When Maharajji came out, you never knew what to expect. He could do the same thing a week in a row until you'd think. Same thing a week in a row until you'd think, well, he'll come out at 8. Then he might not come out all day, or he might just go into another room and close the door and be in there for 2 days. You had to learn to expect the unexpected. One day he came out, and all he said all day long was, "Thal, thal, nan, nan," repeating these words to himself like a mantra. Days went by like this, and somebody finally said, "Maharajji, what are you saying?" And it turned out to be an old Behari dialect, and all it meant was too big, too little, too little. When he was finally asked why he was saying this, he said, "Oh, all you people, you all live in Thal Thal Nan Nan. You live in the world of judgment. It's always too big or too little. You can never know as you sit before Maharajji who it is that he is working with it in the course of a darshan. He may be talking with one person while another is being deeply moved in some special way. You yourself can't know what you are receiving from him." One aspect of being with Maharajji that struck me and a lot of people was the multi-leveled nature of the experience. We would just be sitting with him and seemingly nothing much would be happening. We'd be having tea, and sometimes he would throw some fruits around, or somebody would come and say a few words. It was all very low-key, but we'd be watching everything that he would do, taking the most extreme delight in the tilt of his head or the movement of his arms. At the same time that we would experience incredible light joy, we'd also have the sensation that we were in the midst of a raging fire. People are sitting quietly around Maharajji, concentrating. Maharajji faces the opposite direction of a person when he picks up on a loose thought, and then he rolls to face the person. With an expression of annoyance and love, he raises one finger or shakes his fist. If someone is meditating, he tweaks his nose or pulls his beard. He turns to a person and tells her that she is very good. Another he maligns, telling all sorts of bad stories. Again he turns to another and says, "Go, you wicked person." And the words and apple and tea and silence and laughter were all washed in a continuous river of love that poured forth from Maharaji. The devotees who knew were equally as happy with Maharaji's insult as with his praise, for it was all palpable love and food for the spirit. We took our cue in this respect from one of Maharaji's long-term trusted devotees called Dada, who served Maharaji with the singleness of purpose that awed us. When Maharaji would compliment him, Dada would say, "Ha Baba," meaning, "Yes Baba." And when Maharaji would shout insults at him, sometimes upbraiding him from morning till night, he would reply in exactly the same tone, "Ha Baba." Obviously, fame and shame were one to him, at least when Maharaji was the source. No longer could Maharaji get Dada angry or guilty. Over the years it had all been burned out. For Dada it was all grace. Sometimes Maharaji would talk to one person and everyone else would listen, perfectly content just to be present. There was the sport of watching the newcomers arrive, skeptical with questions, and then seeing their hearts gently open and their soft flower-like quality emerge under the tender care of the master gardener. We would sit in those groups as Maharaji turned this way and that, attending now to a person at his side and the next moment to a devotee far distant who was just entering the temple. And as he changed the mood of the group from easy laughter to fierce intensity in a moment and then back again, one felt at such times as if Maharaji were the puppeteer and we are puppets. Maharaji's company was very special. He was always natural, like a child, assent in the traditional manner. He set no condition, nor expected any particular behavior from his devotees. He was rarely affected by the outside. He could converse with half a dozen people simultaneously with the camera held a foot from his face. He had no form. He performed no rituals or puja. He followed no orthodox customs such as ritual bathing. Yet his presence was more than inspiring, it was enlightening. While meditating in or near his presence, even though he'd been talking and joking loudly, one quickly reached the place of clear light, a place difficult to achieve without his grace and power. Timeless darshans. Maharaji often counseled the Indian devotees to sit in silence, just to sit, listen and absorb. But around Maharaji that was difficult to do, for there was a continuous and compelling drama going on around him. Who came, who went, what they said, what food was being distributed, who got to sit closest to him, how he was working with each person, which person he patted and which he yelled at, how he moved about on the tucket. One Indian told us that those of us who did not speak Hindi were lucky because it kept us from getting too involved. When there was a little silence or when you could detach yourself from the melodrama, you could just bask in the timeless grace of his presence. The minute you meet him, if you are ready, he will plant himself within you, the seed, and time is nothing. You'd forget everything when you were with him. There would be nothing but Maharaji, total effortless worship. That's the real puja. Sometimes we would sit up so late at night in Kanchi talking with Maharaji that we would lose all sense of time until we would hear someone taking their morning bath and we would realize that the whole night was gone. It was one of those darshans where you think somebody must have put LSD in the tea. We would bask in his radiance. Actually, you can be more truly with Maharaji when you are away from his form. At a distance, you can concentrate on him undisturbed. Darshan on intimacy. For others, what stands out is the precious intimacy that comes from experiencing another being within the same space that your own being occupies. The whisper of a lover who knows your innermost heart. Maharaji never preached, never lectured. He spoke within your heart. With him, one automatically knew everything. It came through the heart, not by reading books. 10 or 20 of us would sit in the back of the ashram at Kanchi talking with Maharaji. One of us would say, "But Maharaji, what about so and so?" Asking some question about God or life. Maharaji would start talking and pretty soon everybody would be in tears. Sometimes he would start talking about Christ and start crying himself. He and I never really had much going on the verbal level, but inside I felt so much love that I'd hang around. When I'd leave, I wouldn't go very far, and I would always come back. It was like that with a lot of people. Maharaji reached each person's heart in a way special to that person. Everyone's experience with him was different. You cannot explain what it is like to be with him. It is a thing to be felt in your heart. He was so gentle that you weren't afraid of him at all, but sometimes you'd think that there must be a lion in there. 3 older young Western women were at Krishna's birthday. While everyone was singing Kirtan in the temple before Lakshmi Narayan, they went over to Maharaji's window, which was shuttered from inside, and began softly singing a song about the baby Krishna, an incarnation of Vishnu, Devaki Nandan Gopala. After some time, Maharaji opened the shutters and angrily told them to go away and slammed the shutters again. This scene was repeated several times while the young woman continued softly singing. Finally, Maharaji again opened the shutters, only this time he had tears streaming down his face, and he listened in a state of bhav, spiritual emotion for quite some time. Remember where Castaneda talks about stopping the world. Sometimes Maharaji would do things to you and you'd feel like it just stopped the world. Sometimes you'd be listening and sometimes not, and then suddenly Maharaji would do something and you'd hang suspended. There was one period in my life when I used to keep whole scrapbooks all about horses. No one else knew about them, and once when my mind was somewhere else, Maharaji turned to me and asked me about horses. My mind just stopped. Every time my mind wandered, Maharaji would catch me. He would never miss. When I wavered from the concentration in the least bit, he would catch me and put me back. Maharaji was sitting on the tucket and he leaned over and kissed Kabir on the head. That kiss affected everyone who was there. It made people feel really warm inside. Every time Maharaji would hug somebody, everybody in the room would go, "Ah." Darshan of love. All the love and affection and kindness that came from Maharaji, you cannot get these from man. How can you describe what it was to be with Maharaji? It is like trying to describe the sweetness of a fruit or the fragrance of a rose. You never have met one so lovable, so kind, so sweet. How could you not love him? You always wanted to give up your breath to him if you could. A devotee asked me if I had ever been caught by Maharaji's glance in a way that as he briefly looked at me, I forgot everything but knew only Maharaji's love. The devotee said, "It is a wonderful and rare thing when he looks at you in that way, and you are very fortunate if you can hold his gaze in that state. He could go through your heart with just a look or a movement, the slightest thing could feel as if it were piercing you. I was leaving for Nepal the next day. It was evening and we were sitting in the back of the ashram. Maharaji never actually mentioned my leaving the next day because I had received a Quit India notice, but at the end of the darshan, he just held my eyes with his. It was the Guru's glance, a look of absolute, universal, total compassion. It was love beyond words, not long but just, my being in his being. And that filled me with such, what's the word for that feeling, grief or longing, or I felt in the look infinite compassion, and even though the glance didn't last very long, its power still comes through to me, particularly at very difficult times. I was only about 16 when I first met Maharaji. It was a Bhandara feast and many people were there. When I met him, I was filled with such bhav, transported, it seemed, by divine love. Maharaji instructed me to serve the devotees at the Bhandara. There were many to be fed, and we worked long hours, but that feeling never left me. When asked what he experienced on meeting Maharaji, one man replied, "It is not something that can be said, it must be experienced. The love, the affection, the compassion, the grace of knowing him." Talking at darshans. He would talk with no limit and with no rhyme or reason. If he was abusing someone, he would go on shouting with no end. But he was hearing everything. What an intoxication! He would behave like a very abnormal man, doing all sorts of nonsense, shouting and abusing. But what made you stay there? You wouldn't be conscious of time and space. You never questioned where you were or why you were there. Days and months would pass with him, and they seemed like a moment. Sometimes I wasn't aware that I had not eaten or slept for days, and he made me do things I wouldn't do in the normal course. If I wanted to leave him, he'd make me stay. If I wanted to stay another night, he'd force me to go. He was always rattling on like a child, talking about this and that, most of which wasn't translated. It was like seeing a fine foreign movie where you don't really need the subtitles. In some instances, he would say a thing only once. If you didn't catch it, it has gone. I was only about 16 when I first met Maharaji. It was a Bhandara feast and many people were there. When I met him, I was filled with such bhav, transported, it seemed, by divine love. Maharaji instructed me to serve the devotees at the Bhandara. There were many to be fed and we worked long hours, but that feeling never left me. When asked what he experienced on meeting Maharaji, one man replied, "It is not something that can be said, it must be experienced. The love, the affection, the compassion, the grace of knowing him." Talking at darshans, he would talk with no limits and with no rhymes or reason. If he was abusing someone, he would go on shouting with no end, but he was hearing everything. What an intoxication! He would behave like a very abnormal man, doing all sorts of nonsense, shouting and abusing. But what made you stay there? You wouldn't be conscious of time and space. You never questioned where you were or why you were there. Days and months would pass with him, and they seemed like a moment. Sometimes I wasn't aware that I had not eaten or slept for days, and he made me do things I wouldn't do in the normal course. If I wanted to leave him, he'd make me stay. If I wanted to stay another night, he'd force me to go. He was always rattling on like a child, talking about this and that, most of which wasn't translated. It was like seeing a fine foreign movie where you don't really need the subtitles. In some instances, he would say a thing only once. If you didn't catch it, it was gone. One Westerner was sitting in front of the Hanuman Murti in Vrindavan. She was very much longing to see Maharaji, but in those days he was refusing to allow Westerners in for darshan. She sat there, head bowed, singing some kirtan. Just then there was some flurry of excitement. She looked up, and there, standing directly in front of her, smiling so very sweetly, was Maharaji. Then, to her delight, he cocked his head and said in English, "Too much." Several Vaishnavas were recalling Maharaji's hit parade of English phrases. A few were coconut, right face, quick march, left, right, go, sit down, bus has come, sometimes, damn fool, commander-in-chief, thank you, stand up, water. When you were with Maharaji, you talked about what it wanted to talk about. If you started your topic, Maharaji would ignore it or change it. There was no conversation around Maharaji or other than with him. Maharaji talked about irrelevancies as if they were very important. Maharaji would talk to one and be hitting another, and only the one who was supposed to would understand. Maharaji showed great interest in everything, just like an ordinary man. He had no pretensions, yet nobody could deceive him. With the Westerners, the talk usually included a series of routines. With many of them, Maharaji developed special routines, and the particular individual would be called to the front day after day to perform the same dialogue. To one young woman, he would ask each day the same question: "What the Indian women like? Why are they good?" She would reply each day with the same answer: "Because they are devoted to their husband." To another devotee, he would ask again and again, "Will you marry?" The devotee would always reply, "Maharaji, how can I marry? I am so useless." To another, "What is your name?" "Chaitanya Mahaprabhu," the name of a great Indian saint, which Mahar would then repeat and cock his head appreciatively. He had trained as well as performing humans. One devotee commented about all this: "Maharaji had his Jew and we were all inmates." And then there was Aarti, the ceremony of life. It is a ceremony for honoring the Guru. A flame is waved before the Guru, and it is accompanied by a chant that enunciates the Guru's many qualities. Under the tutelage of K.K. Shah, one of the long-time Indian devotees, we had learned the entire Sanskrit chant and how to perform the ceremony in order to surprise Maharaji. When we finally performed the Aarti, Maharaji was seemingly so delighted that he made us perform it over and over again, even though while we did it, he talked continuously to one or another of those gathered around about him. And from that time on, whenever a new group of Indian devotees came to pay their respect, we were trotted out from the rear of ashram to perform Aarti and thus show how spiritual the Vaishnavas really were. Through these many repetitions, we learned much. Initially, we had wanted to please and impress Maharaji. Later, the prayer became just more spiritual materialism. But through the constant repetition, we come to appreciate how a ritual can take on a life of its own and generate a spiritual power independent of the specific reason for which it is being performed at any one time. Chiding and playfulness at darshans. One of Maharaji's devotees was 80 years old and very spree, like a mountain god. One day he came in for Maharaji's darshan when a young, distant relative of his was also there. The relative pranarmed to the old devotee but didn't get up. Maharaji turned to the elder and said, "If you had money, he'd get up and touch your feet." Once a devotee wore a new and expensive sari to darshan. Maharaji said, "You know, Ma, I went to this wealthy family for a visit, but they were such simple clothes that you couldn't tell the difference between the rich ones and the poor ones. So simple and clean." One evening, Maharaji was out squatting on a dirty street when along came some important people, poets, judges and officials. As they stood around Maharaji, he asked them, "Why don't you sit?" With some hesitation, they sat down on the street. Immediately, Maharaji arose. "Okay, let's go." I had purchased some apples in Mathura to take as prasad, an offering usually food which become consecrated when accepted by Maharaji for Maharaji. They were costly and I had hand-picked them. When I offered them, Maharaji said, "Put them away, eat them later." I wouldn't do it because of my pride. So I peeled the first and it was rotten, and so with the second and the third and the fourth. Maharaji looked at me and said, "I told you to put them away." I discovered later that the other 5 were fine. I was working in Agra, and whenever Maharaji came to Vrindavan, I would take him 10 or 15 rupees worth of prasad. I would see others coming with so much more that one Sunday I felt quite bad because I could only bring so little. Monday morning I was waiting to touch his feet before going off to work, and I thought to myself, with my limits, my 10 rupees are worth 10,000 of someone else. Just then Maharaji came out of his room saying, "Strange people come to me and offer 10 rupees and say they have offered 10,000. There was one expression he would never allow me to catch with my camera. He'd be sitting normally and then all of a sudden he would straighten up and look directly down at you, his eyes wide open and intense. I tried for months to catch that expression. I'd take a photograph, but in the time it took to advance the reel, he'd return to normal, giggling and laughing. He'd look at me and smile with delight at my frustration. I wish I had motor drive. Once he walked over to me and took my bamboo staff and began to do this Chaplinesque dance with it. He moved it back and forth as if he had never been seen a stick before. As he were a large monkey, he started playing with it and moving it around. Then he just threw it away and walked down the road. That was the end of that darshan. I was the only one who saw this happen. One morning, the coals in the brazier in front of Maharaji had gotten really low, so they piled some wood on it, and of course, the wood started to smoke and wouldn't light. So Maharaji said they should pour some kerosene on it, which they did, but still it didn't light. Big clouds of smoke were coming up. Maharaji was leaning forward, looking, and then all of a sudden, pow! The flames leaped right up to the roof. Maharaji jumped back, as delighted as a child, giggling and clapping his hands. He was so thrilled. One day I got to the ashram very early, and I was just sitting over on the porch. Some man arrived carrying a gun. Of course, Maharaji said, "Bring it over. Let me see that rifle." So the man opened up the barrel and checked the chamber to make sure it wasn't loaded, even though it was a shotgun broken in the middle. He wanted to make sure it wasn't loaded. Maharaji took it and opened it up, and then he snapped it shut and held it up to his shoulder as you would to shoot it. He played a while, opening it up and snapping it shut, then gave it back to the man and sent him away. After the man had left, he asked, "Why does he carry a gun?" I said, "I don't know." My standard answer. And Maharaji said, "He carries it because he is afraid of things."